Hey, Sarah Lefton from Bim Bom here.
And I'm Kyle Oliver. I'm an Episcopal priest.
Cool. So we both happen to be here at the Kenyon Institute's spiritual writing program called Beyond Walls, and it's for all kinds of clergy. And so I thought that as long as we're here as people who usually talk about the Torah by Jews, with Jews, that it would be fun to talk about it with a priest. So that's what we're doing together. It's really interesting to me how Christians read the Hebrew Bible, and I've been finding out that it's interesting and sometimes controversial. So why don't we start with the fact that Christians call our texts, or our collective texts, the Old Testament?
Yeah, I think that's something we should consider stopping doing. I think it's better to call them the Hebrew Scriptures because that's what they are. That reminds us that Jesus and his early followers were Jews. And so it gives us an important historical perspective on the text. I also worry that when we say Old Testament, we are implying lesser or less important or no longer meaningful. And I think that at worst, that can feed into a certain brand of Christian thinking called Supersessionalism, which is this fancy word for the idea that Christians replace Jews as God's chosen people, which I think is a terrible thing to think about God. And so I am much more comfortable with the phrase Hebrew Scriptures.
And is that typical in the Episcopal Church, or is this Kyle talking?
I think there's a change afoot. I think it's something that we're actively thinking about.
Could you give us an example of how a Christian might read a Hebrew text?
Sure. Well, just the other day, we heard in the Christian world, we heard the binding of Isaac. And if you're familiar with that text, you know that it is a little scary, a little sort of horrifying that God would ask Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. And, part of interpreting that text is making sense of the sort of horror of that. And it's really tempting for Christians, and I felt myself tempted to do this, to try to sort of lessen the impact of that text by pointing out this sort of Christian idea about it, which is that Christians believe that Jesus was the Son of God, and that Jesus gave himself as a sacrifice for sin. So a sort of Christian move to make with that text is to say, well, see, God isn't asking Abraham to do anything that God wouldn't do, which I guess is a fair enough Christian point. But to me, it puts a Christian idea onto a text in a way that certainly wasn't intended originally, and it seems to sort of change the meaning of what the text is trying to do.
Is that a reading that's common?
I think it's pretty common. It certainly was there in the materials that I was, looking at when I was preparing my sermon, and it was in an early draft of my sermon. I didn't like the way it felt, partly because I serve a church on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and we have a lot of interfaith families, and so I try to be as sort of clear as I can about Christian ideas and Jewish ideas, and really try to support them, and so it felt especially weird, and it got cut from that draft of the sermon.
Yeah, it's something that's definitely been interesting to me. When you look through the history of art, for instance, there's a lot of these kinds of Christian readings of that story into the really robust collection of art there is, right? And you see Christian motifs put onto the Akedah. But Kyle and I were just talking earlier about how neat it would be to do a visual of the binding of Isaac story and to show how it could be interpreted in multiple ways. So maybe watch out for that.
Yeah.
So question, has this made you think any differently about interfaith conversations? Do you disagree with Kyle? Do you agree with him? Let us know in the comments below, respectfully. Of course, we know there are a lot of different opinions out there, and we're genuinely eager to hear what you have to say. Thanks, and see you later.